So welcome back, everyone. I'm Michael Farrell. I'm chairman of the Education Committee of the World Affairs Council Board, and I'm also managing director for SEI Private Wealth Management. Before turning the podium back to Craig to continue our discussions, I wanted to just note a couple of items. The first of which is that participation in the World Affairs Council Speaker Series, such as today, helps support our decades-old commitment to education and to advancing global awareness and knowledge in middle and high school programs throughout the Philadelphia area, including a very special relationship that we enjoy with the Bodine School. Throughout the day today, you might have seen several students from Upper Darby High School, Jenks Academy for the Arts and Sciences, Gill Academy, and of course, Bodine as well. We're very proud of the work that we do with these schools, but we're also very proud of the volunteerism and contribution that these students make to the council itself. So I'd like to ask any of the students who are standing or sitting in the audience to please stand up. And then I'd like to invite the rest of you to join me in a round of applause for these students. With that acknowledgement, I'll turn it back to Craig.
Thank you, Michael. Let me get right into the substance of what I think promises to be another fascinating and really important discussion, which we've titled Energy and Climate, Will We Light the World or Burn It? When one looks at satellite photographs of the Earth at night, one sees, perhaps most powerfully, the gaps between the light and the dark areas of our planet. And there is a very substantial correlation between the bright areas and those in which people have the highest standard of living, and vice versa. There's no doubt that the consumption of energy is a foundational element for modernity. Energy brings light, heat, cooling, transportation and communications, manufacturing, and modern medicine. Energy poverty, by contrast, is very highly correlated with absolute poverty, and the human misery that that state of affairs still brings to well over 1 billion of our fellow people. On the other hand, the race to modernize and thus to electrify and to provide access to transportation and all the other aspects of modernity, which we certainly take for granted in the United States, seems also to be a race towards global climate change. We all know some basic facts. Last year was the warmest year in recorded history. 14 of the 15 warmest years in recorded history have been in just the 15 years of this century. Levels of carbon in the atmosphere have reached, or shortly will, a level that scientists believe has not been seen for 800,000 years. And there is scientific consensus that human activities, most especially the use of fossil fuels as our primary source of energy, is at least among, if not the cause of these environmental changes. So I'd like to turn to our distinguished panel to discuss this conundrum. Do we have to choose between lighting the world and burning it? Is there a way to light the world without the worst environmental impacts? Joining in this discussion, I first would like to introduce Jesse Simmons, the Chief of Staff at the Sierra Club. Since arriving at the Sierra Club in 2001, Jesse's been a key player in developing the club's strategy on clean energy, most notably in his role as architect for the club's Beyond Coal campaign. In his current role as Chief of Staff, he's responsible for helping the Sierra Club envision and execute on an ambitious vision to get to 100% clean energy by 2050. Prior to joining the Sierra Club, Jesse was a technology entrepreneur and served in leading roles in several internet companies, including the company he founded, Nonstop Net. We also have Alisa Harris, who is Vice President of Government and Public Affairs at UGI Energy Services Incorporated. Prior to working at UGI, Alisa served as Special Deputy Secretary to the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. And finally, we have Dr. Stewart Prager, Director at the United States Department of Energy's Princeton Plasma Physics Laboratory. He arrived as the 6th director of the laboratory, and the first to be recruited without previous ties to the laboratory or to Princeton, which runs the facility for the Department of Energy. Each of our guests will make opening remarks, as we have throughout the day, and then we will engage in some further conversation and some questions from all of you. I'd like to start with Jesse. Thanks.
Thanks, Craig. Thank you all. So I want to start off by saying that I am quite optimistic, actually, that we are going to light the future rather than burn it, because I'm 100% confident that we can power the world with 100% clean energy much faster than conventional wisdom would have us believe. Now, before I get into all the various reasons why I'm so optimistic, I want to take a step backwards and talk about the Great Manure Crisis of 1894. Back in the late 1800s, this was the big environmental crisis of the day. You couldn't walk through the streets because of manure. They were predicting, the scientists of the day were predicting that manure could reach the second story of many of our biggest buildings. People were very, very concerned about this, so they called a giant conference, the Great Manure Conference. And it was supposed to be 10 days, but after 2 days, they threw up their hands and said, we can't solve this. We cannot solve this problem. Meanwhile, they were completely oblivious to the fact that the horseless carriage was taking off at that exact time. Here's a quote from Scientific American: "The automobile has practically reached the limit of its development, suggested by the fact that during this past year, no improvements of a radical nature have been introduced." So, but we know what happened, right? The car, which is being written off by many of these experts, solved this problem, which was, it was hailed as an environmental hero, which is quite ironic, right? Considering that it is now one of the primary problems facing us right now is the pollution from cars, but back then it was hailed as an environmental hero. So while the great crisis of our day is the climate crisis, and the, I don't want to say that the manure crisis is at all comparable. This is clearly a much more significant problem we're facing, both in terms of the impacts that we feel today. This is a picture from Hurricane Sandy. I live in California, where we didn't get any rain for the first time in recorded history in January. We were out on the beach last week in shorts and a t-shirt, which that part's not so bad, but the fact that we have no water is quite frightening. So clearly the impacts are much worse than what people are experiencing with the Great Manure Crisis, and the projections of what we're going to see in the future, of course, much more dramatic. Instead of manure up to the second story of buildings in a few cities, we're talking about entire coastlines being flooded and hundreds of millions of people being displaced. But the lesson of the manure crisis is, I think, instructive, and that is that people don't see the solutions that are sitting right in front of them because they have trouble imagining a world that's different than the one they live in today. And back then they were having trouble imagining a world where transportation wasn't completely dependent on horses. And today we have challenge imagining a world that isn't dependent on fossil fuels and dirty fuels. How big is that challenge? It's quite big. But the solution, I think, is pretty simple. The solution to get to where we need to go is we have to quickly squeeze fossil fuels and dirty fuels like nuclear out of the energy that we use by ramping up solar, wind, geothermal, and reducing the total amount of energy we use in our homes, buildings, and cars. This is a graphic taken from Professor Mark Jacobson's groundbreaking study around how to get America to 100% clean energy, and this is basically the vision. And we need to do this because the latest science is quite clear that we need to keep 2/3 of fossil fuels underground if we're going to avoid the worst consequences of climate change. And that means countries like the United States have to lead the way and do something just like that and get to 100% clean energy. The good news is that, the other good news, is that the solutions are actually already here and they're working. This chart basically shows how much dirty energy and clean energy have been coming online globally since 2000. The red line represents dirty energy and the blue line represents clean energy. And what you can see clearly from this is that in 2013, we crossed the Rubicon and we actually installed globally more renewable energy than all dirty energy combined. Almost 60% of the energy that was installed in 2013 was clean. And the same thing was true in 2014. Nearly a quarter of all the world's energy that's installed right now is clean and renewable. How many people knew that? Right. People don't know the basic facts of clean energy yet, but it's coming. It is ready. And the reason it's ready is because smart leaders in several countries and a few pioneering states put in place policies to drive manufacturing and get it to scale so that prices would drop. Solar prices have dropped 80% in the last 5 years. We are now installing more solar every quarter in America than we did in all of 2008. Solar employs 22 times solar is growing 20 times more faster than the economy as a whole, and there are more people working in the solar industry than in the entire coal industry. It is growing, it is fast, it is big, and the same thing's true in the wind industry. Prices have dropped 60%. There are now 10 states in this country that get more than 10% of their power from wind, and a couple that are heading towards 50%. And these aren't states like, California, where I'm from, or Oregon, or Washington, or New York. These are dark red states like Oklahoma, North Dakota, Texas, states that are doing it not because they necessarily believe in climate change, but because they know it's the best, cheapest way to keep the lights on. So, bottom line is clean energy is ready. And so the problem that we're facing is not one of it's too expensive, or it can't get to scale, or it's not ready to integrate. The real problem is the politics. Now, one really clear element of the political problem we face is that the same companies that are polluting our environment are polluting our democracy. Just last week, the Koch brothers announced that they're going to spend $1 billion on the next presidential election. $1 billion. That's more than the entire Republican Party plans to spend in this election. That's also more than John Kerry and George Bush together spent in 2004. And you better believe, these guys sit at the top of one of the world's largest private petrochemical, empires. And you gotta believe that whoever they're electing, they're gonna do everything they can to make sure that person crushes clean energy. But there's another element to the political problem we're facing that doesn't get quite as much attention, and that is even the people who wanna solve the problem, people like President Barack Obama, my governor Jerry Brown, your governor Tom Wolf, they still can't quite imagine a world beyond fossil fuels, just like their predecessors couldn't imagine a world beyond horses. And that's why you see things like Barack Obama doing a lot of great stuff on climate and then opening up the offshore drilling permits all along the Atlantic coast. So the political solution, I think, is also simple. Basically, we the people have to stand up and demand of our leaders that they go all in on clean energy. That's what we need. And we need to start punishing those Republicans who deny the basic science, and we have to start punishing those Democrats who keep saying all of the above and don't say, I'm all in on clean energy. So I'll just conclude by quoting President Barack Obama, who recently observed that, what did he recently observe? Something really brilliant. That we are the first generation to experience the impacts of climate change and the last ones that can do anything about it. And if we want to light the future rather than burn it, now is the time for us to believe in humanity's ability to innovate out of this crisis by seizing the opportunity to go all in on clean energy. Thank you.
Well, I can say, Jesse almost had me. About halfway in, I was like, go, Jesse, go, I'm with you. And you lost me, and I'm still trying to figure out where that was. But thank you, Jesse, and I'm pleased to be here. We do actually agree on a number of points. I think for anyone to have a meaningful dialogue about our future, about the possibility of making things safe and environmentally protective for this current generation and future generations, I think you have to have somewhat of a broader view of what is clean, what is dirty, what's good, what's bad, what's negative, and what's beneficial, though. I think any meaningful conversation about energy and environmental protection or stewardship has to, you just have to be willing to think outside the box. I think you have to be willing to support more research, more development. You have to be willing to say, okay, let's learn past lessons. But I also think to be a truly productive and meaningful conversation, you have to deal with what we are all dealing with on a daily basis, and how to heat our homes, how to keep the lights on. In the most I would say positive economic growth opportunities, putting education a part of that conversation, and making sure that we're not forced with, too many times I think this is where we get caught up. I think too many times we're put in a position where we feel like we have to make a decision on environmental protection or economic growth or stewardship. And I think, quite frankly, where Jesse and I do agree is that we have to be more creative, we have to be driven, we do all have a responsibility to come to the table and try to find solutions. There are short-term, there are long-term solutions. I'm not quite the type of person that would say dirty energy versus clean energy. Clearly, there are consequences across the board in terms of activities that take place every day, including the generation of energy. My point of view, and I think what most of people in my industry would say, is that future energy development is something that there's room for all of us at the table. I think nuclear does play an important role going forward. I think renewables absolutely, without a question, can play a major role going forward. But like I said, many of us are dealing with the reality of day to day, right now. How do we address social issues? How do we deal with keeping the lights on in our homes? How do we make investments in our homes so that we can feel good about what's happening in the future? Jesse talked about the warmest winter, or the warmest time last year, and I thought, oh my goodness, I remember this time last year we were all freezing. We were experiencing the polar vortex. What I can say to you, and what I talk to my colleagues and the people that I kind of hang with every day, is the fact that we saw major impacts from that. Natural gas played a huge role in keeping the lights on and actually keeping our homes warm last year. What we're seeing in the very near future, we could be experiencing the same type of phenomena. So what I would say is natural gas, and I hope that's in the category of clean energy. Do we agree on that?
Sorry, no.
That's where he lost me, by the way. Now I know. But the use of natural gas in so many different applications helped us last year, was a game changer for many of our communities. It kept the lights on. It kept families in a position where they could feed their families. And I just think if we're going to have any meaningful conversation, we have to deal with that reality, because very soon, it could happen today, we could see severe weather events, and I guarantee you today, natural gas is ready to play a major role in making sure that we have the resources that we need. So again, I think most of the conversation today, and any conversation you have going forward, you have to realize that there's not just one answer. And again, I will go out at the beginning and the very end agreeing with Jesse that we all have to play a role, we all have to be creative, we all have to put our best foot forward here. But where I think we may disagree is that it's not just one choice. I think there's a role for coal, there's a role for natural gas, there's a role for nuclear, and I certainly believe that there's a role for renewables. And I think by the end of this afternoon, we can all start having conversations about how do we, bring private industry? How do we bring regulators? How do we bring environmental groups to the table and start having a meaningful conversation rather than drawing lines? That's my wish, and that's my reality. So.
Okay, well, those are two interesting sets of comments to follow. I think that there's no question that we need to move toward a world where we have zero carbon-producing energy. I think The need for energy is galloping forward in the third world, and climate change is global and it's real, so we have to head toward zero carbon-producing energy sources. I'm here to tell you about one contributor to that solution, so I do agree that there are many contributors to that solution and no one panacea. So I'm here to speak about a potentially transformative way to produce energy in the 21st century, and that's fusion energy. And fusion energy, like any transformational technology, brings several facets into play. One is fundamental science. Fundamental science is what drives new technologies. Fusion energy has required the development of a new field of basic physics. In the context of which we're talking, there's the application of energy, and I'll get to why fusion is attractive in a moment. A third facet is international context. And we should remind ourselves, for energy, we're solving a global problem. If we go to zero carbon production in the United States, it's way insufficient. We have to do it worldwide. And in introducing a disruptive technology in the positive sense, there's international competition who will own the technology. But I'll describe to you that in fusion, there's also a perhaps unprecedented level of international cooperation, which is pretty amazing. And the fourth thing that fusion brings to the table that any potentially disruptive technology does is thinking in the long term. Fusion is not going to be a major contributor to the goal of getting to zero carbon production by 2050. It's not. So fusion is going to enter 2040 and 2050 and beyond. If you look at the predicted rates of energy usage or carbon production, if we don't do anything, it increases significantly from here to 2050, and then from 2050 to 2100, it goes through about another doubling. So even if we meet the very ambitious milestone, which we should meet, of reducing carbon production to zero by the techniques that Jesse referred to, that's going to be drastically insufficient for the second half of the century. So what I want to do in my remaining few minutes is tell you what fusion energy is, why all the advanced technological countries in the world are pursuing this quest, where we've gotten to date, and what the next steps are. So I'll do all that in about 60 seconds for each, okay? What is fusion? Fusion is the energy source of the universe. The sun and all their stars generate their energy by the process of nuclear fusion. Two positively charged nuclei fuse and give rise to products that are much faster moving. It's a very powerful nuclear process. It's easy to make a bomb out of it. That's the H-bomb. It's hard to use it for peaceful purpose. So the goal is to make a sun here on Earth, and that's a very apt metaphor. We want to take a gas, heat it to 100 million degrees. It will turn into what's called a plasma, which is an electrically charged gas like the sun and a flame and all the stars in the universe. Once you have a gas with appropriate fuel at 100 million degrees, fusion will occur. Heat will flow out of this big hot plasma, and then you use the heat to convert to hot steam and turn a turbine that connects onto the conventional grid. That's what it is. That's the vision. And once physicists realize that's what causes the stars to burn, they realize maybe this can be used for peaceful purpose. Why is this of interest from an energy point of view? Four major reasons. One, it's essentially limitless. There's enough fuel in the oceans, enough deuterium in the oceans to last for about 1 million years. And the other fuel of tritium is bred in the reactor. And there's fine print details here, but fusion is essentially limitless. When I got into the field in the 70s, I remember there was long gas lines. We were running out of energy, and that was a big draw. But nowadays, an equally big attraction is it's clean. Its contribution to greenhouse gas production is zero. It's completely green energy source. Thirdly, it's safe. Even though it's a nuclear process, there's no chance of a catastrophic accident, no chance of a runaway reaction or any kind of serious explosion. It's because for two reasons. One, it's hard to keep the thing hot. Any malfunction, it cools down and everything quenches, energy stops. At any moment in the future fusion reactor, there's enough fuel for it to produce energy only for a few minutes, so it's safe. And fourth, it will be available to all nations that have the technological know-how, which should be universal. Doesn't depend on localized natural resources, so should reduce conflict there. It makes it almost an ideal energy source in its attributes. What's the catch? It's one of the most difficult scientific and engineering challenges ever undertaken, period. So where are we? Well, we've developed this field of plasma physics to a very mature level, so we have a very good understanding of the science that underlies fusion reactors. It would be difficult to describe now the increase in that understanding, but let me just describe a few milestones. In the mid-90s, we made, just as an experiment, about 15 million watts of fusion power produced for 1 second. And it was in agreement with the theoretical expectations. So we have made fusion power in the laboratory, although those experiments consume more power than they produced. If you look at figures of merit, the amount of fusion power produced in the laboratory versus year, when I entered the field, we were producing milliwatts, 1,000th of a watt, and now we've made 15 million watts. So actually the progress has been rapid. Where are we going? I'll just tell you one next step to indicate where we're going. The world has gotten together on an amazing collaboration. It started in a summit conference between Reagan and Gorbachev, and now is coming to fruition. It's to build an experiment in France that is under construction, will begin operation in about 10 years. It's a collaboration where the governments of half the world's population have come together just for this peaceful purpose. So it's quite remarkable in that way. It involves the European Union, Japan, South Korea, India, Russia, United States, and maybe I'm leaving someone out, but there's 7 parties, including the European Union, which is the main host. The US and everybody else except the European Union are 9% partners. This experiment is called ITER, I-T-E-R. In Latin, it stands for the way. It used to be an acronym that stood for International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor. It will, if successful, produce 500 megawatts, 500 million watts of fusion power, still as an experiment, and it'll produce that power for about 8 minutes at one time and then do it repetitively. It's still an experiment that will establish the feasibility in a scientific and technological sense of fusion. So this is a major contributor to our energy, and it will begin about 2050 or so. There are still scientific and engineering hurdles, but we think we know how to solve those problems and get to the end point. And so I'm going to close by saying, actually, Jesse's closure, that solution to this problem only requires the societal will and innovation, and that's exactly what's needed to bring fusion to realization. Thank you.
So I want to ask, do this a little differently than the prior panels. I want to ask a particular question to each of the three of you in succession, in what I hope is designed to make you sort of think from somewhat alternative perspectives and perhaps get a good dialogue going. So Jesse, I want to start with you. Earlier this year, I had the chance to visit China as a part of a National World Affairs Council delegation that was actually devoted substantially to climate and energy issues. We had a number of high-level meetings, and what I can tell you is that there was a huge gap between the on-the-record and the off-the-record discussions. So on the record, Chinese policymakers were great champions of controlling carbon emissions and seeking to address climate change. Off the record, what I heard was we have hundreds of millions of people still living in a pre-industrial world, and they need power. And we are going to burn whatever it takes to get them out of poverty and into the modern world. Likewise, similarly, sort of related, the World Affairs Council recently hosted a former senior official from the central bank in Nigeria. who's written extensively about poverty and development issues in sub-Saharan Africa. And that commentator was even more pointed on the record about global climate change policy. It basically said the West caused this problem, put carbon in the atmosphere for 200 years, and now wants to block the ability of poorer countries to get out of poverty through a regime of global climate emission regulation, global carbon emission regulation. Basically said this is a new form of colonialism. My question for you is, we've heard similar comments from people in India, important officials in India, and so on. You look at Japan, the world's third largest economy. They've turned off all nuclear power, and they've gone back to using fossil fuels very substantially. So the question is, can a rich world be powered without fossil fuels, without a breakthrough like fusion? So if you can explain sort of in a little bit more detail, obviously constricted by our time here, how it is that you believe 2050 we can get to zero emissions, not just for the United States, but in the context of these other countries that seem to have a very different paradigm about this.
Mm-hmm. Great question and a hard question. And it seems like there's kind of two questions there. One is, can we power growing global prosperity without continuing to rely on fossil fuels for very long and without some new breakthrough technology, right?
Right.
All right, so I think the answer to both questions is a resounding yes. We can definitely power prosperity across the world, not just in the United States, but across the world, without relying on gas, coal, oil, or nukes. And we can do it without some major breakthrough like fusion, despite the fact that I do like fusion and I've investigated and think it's cool. I don't think we need it, and as the good doctor just pointed out, it's not going to be ready until 2040 or 2050 anyway, so we need some solutions right now. And the reason I don't think we need that breakthrough, and the reason I don't think we need fossil fuels, is because that breakthrough has already happened. It's called the massively dropping price of wind, solar, and storage. That's the story people aren't talking about. We don't actually need some new big thing. That's happened. And I mentioned in my speech the pieces about all the pricing in the United States, but that's true globally. And I'll give you an example. In Pakistan recently, they were running out of gas, which is something that happens when you rely on a fossil fuel. It will run out, right? So just when you start talking about reliability issues, you need to know that the fundamental thing you're using is a finite resource, whereas clean energy is not. But so they're running out of gas, they have locally, and they decide, let's build some coal plants. So they go out and they build a bunch of coal plants, and it turns out that those coal plants are costing them something in the range of 18 cents a kilowatt hour to install coal. Meanwhile, China and India are installing huge amounts of wind and solar. The wind's coming in at 8 cents a kilowatt hour, and solar's coming in at 13 cents a kilowatt hour, already significantly cheaper than the dirty energy. So I think the point here is clean energy is actually ready to do the job. And I also just want to say, I think it was implicit in your question that the people in China you were talking to were still imagining that they could go down this pathway of building more coal plants. And I think that's a complete fantasy, largely because the Chinese government is under so much pressure right now because of the quality of the air, right? That's the number one reason people are protesting. They know it. Air apocalypse happened last year. I'm sure you all heard about it. But the lifespans in China have gone down 5 years in the modern era. Usually you expect that as you modernize, you live longer, per that last conversation. But no, actually they're living 5 years less. And the reason is because of all the pollution from coal, gas, and oil. And so, it's not just that. The mayor of Beijing just announced last week that Beijing is no longer a livable city. This is a city of 21 million people. What do? They're building bubbles around schools in China so people can play sports. It's like, that is just not feasible. It's not just China. In India, the World Health Organization just said that New Delhi has worse air than China. So I just don't believe there's any feasible pathway by which we could keep relying on fossil fuels, nor do we need to, because the clean energy is ready today. It's cheaper, it's better, it's local, and it's inexhaustible. So that's my answer.
Thank you. Alisa, the fossil fuel industry obviously continues to dominate the world's energy business. Fossil fuels are in great demand and still growing demand. and with currently falling prices, continues, despite, obviously Jesse's mentioned some other data points, but in general continues to be less expensive than renewable sources in many cases. My question for you, though, is the price of fossil fuels does not take into account the potential cost of continuing to burn fossil fuels at increasing rates if the predictions about the impacts on human life from climate change are true or even remotely true. In other words, the potential catastrophe of climate change is what economists call an externality in the free market pricing mechanism for fossil fuel energy. So does that, if you accept that as a factual premise, does that not require that governments in the world do, by regulation, by taxation, by subsidizing alternative sources, by research and development expenditures, by a whole variety of government means, essentially force the externality of climate change to be taken into account in the pricing of relative energy sources in a way that the free market just can't do?
Yeah, I definitely, I'm trying to figure out. Thank you.
Sorry.
I definitely think there's a role for government, and I think for all of us sitting here, I think we can all be a part of that conversation. What I do know is that the demand for energy is increasing every day. I mean, and we talked about what's happening over in other countries, and the fact is they're looking to us now, they're looking to the United States to use some of the energy sources that we have. And I think there's, a lot of discussion about the import, domestic use versus exportation. I think, again, I talked earlier about lessons learned. There are clearly lessons learned here in the United States, here in Pennsylvania, as well as other countries. I would also say that natural gas, sometimes people will refer to natural gas as a bridge fuel. And, I somewhat don't agree with that characterization. I think it's a fuel that here in Pennsylvania, we can, just 100 miles away from here possibly, we have supplies that, we have every reason to believe, based on some of the recent data, that resource is going to be here and available for both use here in Pennsylvania as well as outside the region and perhaps out of the country with LNG exports. So I'm not as I guess I'm more optimistic that we do have a source here, a local source that we will be able to use for several generations. I think the days of using coal as your major source of energy, I think we could probably all agree that we're beyond that, and that's not going to be the situation going forward. But I don't want people to get caught up in the idea that natural gas, whether or not you agree that there's enough for future generations, it's just something that we just take advantage of for the next couple of years until something else comes along. Natural gas is one way of meeting the energy needs for our country and other countries. And whether or not we become a net exporter or what have you, that's a different conversation. But I think, again, I want us to kind of stay focused on what we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. I think conservation, I think energy efficiency, I think the role of renewables, they all play a very important role, and there's just not one fix. One of the things I was going to talk about earlier is this time last year I read an article here in the Philadelphia area that talked about the need for some of the nonprofits in the area needing more money for LIHEAP programs, people who needed help with paying their energy bills. And I remember my first thought was, oh wow, I'm ready to write a check. But I think the bigger issue is, what are we doing in the long term to make sure that they have resources, affordable, abundant supplies of energy sources so that they can make the right decisions and not have to choose between, keeping the lights on, keeping their houses warm, or, going to the movies. So I think the days of coal are gone. I think, again, other technologies around nuclear industry, that's promising. But I just want people to know that based on the projections that we've seen and the demand and the cost, we just think natural gas is a good solution. And I agree. Absolutely, I think things are improving at a steady and a promising pace for renewables, but I would still say at the end of the day that we're not there yet. I do think there needs to be more time and attention and effort and support for bringing renewables on board. But while it's getting cheaper, there are other resources that when you look at dollar to dollar and look at all the impacts across the board, I think you would argue that natural gas development is an even more affordable option.
Thank you. So, Stewart, the question I want to ask you before we turn to our audience is this, and you sort of touched on it, but perhaps you can explicate a little further. So I've been reading that fusion power was about 20 years away from commercialization for most of my life. Is it okay to be skeptical about the prediction that you made of 2040 or 2050, and just sort of ask, will it ever really happen? And then beyond that, if fusion is commercialized, do you see any downside, any sort of unintended consequences, as has proven to be the case with almost every technology human beings have ever developed? What is the case against fusion, please?
Oh, good. It's on the first question. It's good to be skeptical. I mean, the joke is fusion is the power source of the future, and it always will be. So I think there's two answers, and you're absolutely right. The pioneers of the field 50 years ago were saying it will be commercialized in 30 years or so, and here we are, and we're saying the same thing. So what's the story? There are two answers to that question. One is the pioneers didn't realize how difficult a scientific task this would be. They underestimated the scientific depth of the problem. I say that bearing in mind that the people that started this field were some of the most brilliant physicists of that era. I mean, one name you'll know is Andrei Sakharov worked on this problem, and I never met him, but I think he would have said it would be commercialized in 30 years, and I have met the other pioneers, and they said they didn't realize it would be quite so difficult. What it required was development of this new field of physics. If you want to, we heard this morning, you want to solve cancer, you got to develop the field of molecular biology. To deliver a fusion reactor, you have to develop the field of plasma physics. Well, now it's 50 years later, and that field is very mature. The second reason we never delivered within 30 years of 1960 is that the money was never delivered. And here the pioneers did give estimates of how much money would be required, and that was never remotely delivered by our government. And in fact, if you sort of roughly trace the progress made versus dollars spent, the pioneers were about right. Now, if you look at where we're going, our projections today rest on much, much firmer scientific evidence than the claims of the pioneers in the field. And this evidence has been reviewed by outside scientific experts at all countries around the world that have looked at the problem, and invariably they judge the projections of 30 years from now to be credible, but not a sure thing. Credible and worth the expenditure, and that's why all the half of the world's population have gotten together to build this experiment. My feeling is that it's a certainty that fusion power can deliver abundant base load power. The question is how quickly and how attractive it will be. The second question is what's the potential negative impacts of fusion energy? And I agree very much with the premise of the question. Any energy source, if you massively deploy it, just massively deploy it, what's the downside? Usually you run into negatives and limits. So for fusion, I think in terms of natural resources consumed, negative, evil applications, for weaponizing, and then the third would be waste production. Those are the kinds of things you run into. And for natural resource consumption, The fuel is deuterium and tritium, isotopes of hydrogen. Deuterium comes out of seawater, and the amount of deuterium we'll use for the next 10,000 years wouldn't make a dent in the deuterium in the ocean. Tritium is bred in the reactor. To breed tritium, you got to use some lithium through a particular process, and there's enough lithium in the Earth's crust to generate fusion power for 1,000 years, and then the oceans have 1,000,000 years more of it. So there's really no resource consumption. No land use is tiny, water use is modest. So it's really very benign in that respect. Weaponizing, I should say, to preface it, there are two approaches to fusion power, and one, which I focus on, is where you confine this hot plasma by a magnetic field. Another one is where you have little exploding pellets. Let me speak of the first one. All right? And there, up until 1958, all research in this area, which wasn't going very long, was classified. And then they realized you can't make any weapon out of this thing. And in 1958, there was one meeting where everybody got up on a stage and shared everything, and it's been a completely 100% shared enterprise ever since and going forward. So there's no weapons application. Fusion does make neutrons, and you can possibly use those neutrons to make fissile material for bombs. But you don't need, unlike a fission reactor, you don't need any fissile material in the fusion process, so it's very easy to safeguard against that. And the third thing is waste, and unlike nuclear fission reactors of today, the fusion reaction generates no waste. It generates helium like you have in a balloon. However, the neutrons that it generates cause the reactor structure to become very mildly radioactive, but maybe 1,000 times less toxic and massive than for fission reactors. So summing all that up, frankly, the negative consequences are very small.
Thanks. I'd like to open for questions from the audience, please. Come on up.
While we're waiting for that, could I quickly respond to one thing? Or two things. Just so on the fusion question, Sierra Club supports research and development into it, and we're on the same page. It's going to take 30 or 40 years before it's ready, so one challenge we have is we actually need to be making a lot more progress in the short term, so we don't have 30 or 40 years to wait. Let's research development. On the gas question, really quickly, I understand why people believe we still need it. The Sierra Club 10 years ago or less believed that natural gas was a bridge to a clean energy future, but two things changed. The first thing that changed was clean energy prices fell through the floor. Like, I'm not making this up. You can Google it, you can read the Financial Times, you can read Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Clean energy is now cheaper than gas for providing electricity. It's just a fact. So we shouldn't be building new gas, and that's one of the reasons why the Sierra Club stopped seeing gas as a bridge. And then the other point is we started realizing exactly how destructive gas was to people's communities, their air, their health, their water, and crucially, the climate. There's this myth out there that gas is somehow better for the climate than coal, but that's increasingly becoming clearly false. Methane, which is the main byproduct of burning gas and fracking for gas, is 72 times more potent than carbon. And we have now seen a number of reports showing that if we were to switch right now from coal to gas, we would see a world that was 6 degrees warmer than today's world. So the thing I want to leave clear for everybody is clean energy is cheaper than dirty fuels today, and we don't have the option of going with gas because it'll leave us in an uninhabitable planet. And fusion, great, I'm looking forward to seeing that work in 2050 if we need it, but for now, I don't believe either of those two options are available to us.
I think, 30 seconds for both of you. I think the uninhabitable planet, you're going to need to. Okay.
So I think.
I knew you were going to do this, Jesse.
In terms of the world doesn't end in 2050.
Let's hope not.
And I think fusion or something is absolutely desperately needed for 2050 and beyond. And if we want to have transformative technologies like fusion available in 2050, it's urgent to develop it now. And that's why it's a topic of conversation for now.
Agreed.
Yeah, please.
And I would just say, there's plenty of opportunities for us to debate, go back and forth, and spar. And he can bring his experts, he can bring his studies, and we both come to the table and figure out, okay, what really is what's really happening. What I do know, and I'm assuming Jesse will agree with me, is that we are seeing great progress in terms of meeting our national goals in terms of, cleaner air, cleaner water, protecting endangered species and different habitat. That's happening because of opportunities like this, because people are coming to the table and saying, what we're doing today can be better and will be better. The only way that I would say I would prescribe to the notion that natural gas is a bridge fuel is because I haven't completely, and I don't think our industry or regulators or policymakers have ended the conversation of what's that next generation look like. Clearly, the fact that we are using more natural gas today, and we're seeing coal plants closing down, we're seeing coal plants adding control technologies, because we are bringing more natural gas technology to the table every day, whether you're looking at reducing emissions from the local distribution companies, if you're looking at decreasing emissions from storage fields, whatever. We all recognize that there is progress to be made and that we all have a role and a responsibility to do that. No question, the air emissions, the environmental impacts from producing, exploring, delivering natural gas, the emissions are lower across the board when you compare it to coal plants. The reality is that, whether we want to agree on global warming or climate change, we all have to take responsibility and use the resources that we have. I don't completely agree with you that solar energy, renewables are cheaper than what it takes to provide, to deliver, to actually produce, deliver, and use natural gas. I can't agree with that. I can't agree that natural gas is, I never repeat a negative, so I won't say it. I think the future is much brighter, and I think as the natural gas industry makes investments into its own research and development, as we make investments into replacing old pipe with new, more modern materials, as we make progress in understanding the full scale or the full spectrum of emissions and how to reduce those, I can't agree that it's all doom and gloom. I think, again, renewables, like everything else, will play in a very important role, but I am not willing to sit here today and agree that natural gas is not a better choice for right now and will not be a good choice going forward.
We call this great debates, and I think it's great to see a debate. So, okay, gentlemen, please.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to ask Mr. Simmons a question, just to clarify what exactly your position is on the cost of, I don't know if I'm hearable over here. I'll squat down here. As to the cost of solar energy versus natural gas, coal, whatever, which of the following two are you claiming? Number one, that the net present value of the cost of a photovoltaic cell stuck on my roof, that's the minus sign, plus the reduction in the cost of electricity as a result of that is greater than, is less than the net present value of the cost of getting that same amount of electricity from my local utility? Or are you claiming that the local utility would save money if they set up a solar farm and got their electricity from that rather than from a plant that uses natural gas or coal or whatever? Or neither
Great.
one?
I'm actually saying both. Right now, in 45 of America's 50 biggest cities, it is cheaper to put solar on your roof than to get dirty energy off the grid. That is a fact. And I'm saying that at the utility scale, people are installing solar now at 5-6 cents a kW in large applications. And when you look at the levelized cost of energy, right, when you take into account the capital costs and the cost to run it with fuel over time, over 20 years, the levelized cost of energy for solar is about half the price you're seeing come in for new coal and significantly cheaper than new gas. And you don't have to trust me. I mean, you can look, Warren Buffett right now is investing massively in clean energy. He's putting something like $16 billion into clean energy. IKEA going to 100% clean energy. Walmart, 100% clean energy. And they're doing it not because they want to save the planet. They're doing it because it's a great way to save money because the electricity is actually cheaper.
If I could have a quick follow-up that I'll leave, and that is, why doesn't the Sierra Club simply create an advertising campaign, especially a written one, showing people how to do the calculations to show them so they can calculate the savings due to solar as compared to the utility, and you'd solve your problem.
So I like this guy. And actually, we did exactly that. We launched a thing called the Solar Homes Program in partnership with a number of different solar companies who were leasing solar. And you can go online. We did a big advertising campaign. Then you can go online and get a quote to see how much would you save by going solar. I myself...
By the way, where will you go online for this?
Go to sierraclub.org or just search Google, Sierra Club Solar Homes, and you'll find it. I did it myself. I put solar in my house. I bought a Ford electric car. And I'm saving something in the range of $2,000 a year by powering my American-made Ford that is getting like, massive miles per gallon. It's a hybrid, gets 90 miles per gallon. I'm powering it with the sun on my roof, and I'm using no fossil fuels, and I'm saving a ton of money, and I got it through the Sierra Club's program. So we're doing exactly that. In fact, your point is at the heart of what the Sierra Club is trying to do right now, and one of the reasons why I agreed to speak today is because I feel like one of the reasons there is this failure of imagination in our American leadership is because people don't know the basic facts around how ready clean energy is today. I mean, your questions are baked in this notion that, well, it's not affordable, but that's actually just not true anymore. It's like, still thinking about horses and not thinking about cars. It's thinking about typewriters, not, computers. It's not the future. We're here.
Thank you.
Take one over here.
I had a question about the process of fusion. So you said you had to heat the gases to around 150 degrees. So how much energy goes into that heating, and what's the net energy gain from the process of fusion today?
Today, we haven't hit the break-even point. So the best is that you put energy in to heat, power into heat, and 70% of that comes out as fusion power. In this experiment that's under construction, 10 times more power will come out than is put in to heat the plasma. Okay, so.
Okay.
Please.
In the context of keeping the lights on in a less harmful way and lighting up more of the world, just how important was the work of Akasaki, Amano, and Nakamura? Physicists in the room might recognize those three names from a few months ago. Nobel?
Yeah, what was it for?
Akasaki, Amano, and Nakamura.
Yeah, but remind me what they did that got them the prize. I can't remember.
Blue LED bulb.
No, I really don't know how that all impacts energy.
I can't speak to exactly what those folks did, but I can certainly say that lighting is one of the big uses of energy right now, and there's no question that LED bulbs are blowing things out of the water, and that's exactly, if you remember back to my slide that showed that it's two things. You're squeezing dirty fossil fuels out by ramping up clean energy, but you don't need nearly as much clean energy as we currently need dirty energy because you're cutting use in half. And one of the big ways you do that is by the massive improvements in things like lighting. And LED light bulbs are one of the most amazing examples. 15 years ago, we were using incandescent bulbs. An LED light bulb uses what? 1,000th of the electricity. I mean, it's amazing. And so we're seeing a lot more of things like that. So I think folks like that deserve a ton of credit, and we need more innovation along those lines to bring that curve down in energy use. But absolutely, efficiency is energy savings is one of the great untapped opportunities. I'm sure we can all agree on that.
We do. For those who didn't follow that, they got the Nobel Prize in Physics a few months ago, I think it was, for having invented the blue LED light, which was not previously done. And by adding that, you then can have white LED bulbs for the first time, which then enables you to replace incandescent, which then leads to all the laws that are getting rid of all the high energy use bulbs and are leading you all to have more energy efficiency. So part of that question is, great that you're looking at how to supply the energy, but you also had that manure question. How do you get rid of the manure? This gets rid of some of the manure. Do you have any idea how much manure we're getting rid of here?
Yeah. What I would say to that is, you know, I probably said it about 2 or 3 times because I normally do, that we all have a responsibility. And some, you know, I'm seeing some of the next generation here in the room. How many of us here in this room were part of, you know, the education rollout of why you recycle, how to recycle? It's just common behavior now. We don't even think twice about it. But, you know, we're dealing with the same thing. You go to Target. You know, 2 times I went to Target and was choosing light bulbs, and, you know, I'm in the aisle more than, you know, a longer time than it usually takes me. There's 2 other people in the aisle grappling, you know, scratching their heads, and I turned one day and said, it's never been so difficult to choose a light bulb before. And the reality is, again, pioneers, environmental advocacy groups, research development, we all have to keep our minds open and look for creative ways to solve solutions. And as I said before, weatherization programs, energy efficiency programs, they have to be a part of a meaningful conversation if we're truly serious about protecting the next generation. And whether you're talking about recycling, if you're talking about storage, any of those types, it's all our responsibility to play a role. There was something else I was going to say, but I forgot.
Thank you.
We're going to come over here. This is a question for Dr. Prager. Last fall, Lockheed Martin announced that they were beginning a program to accelerate the engineering cycle time for fusion, to do packaged fusion reactions. They were saying that they could get the cycle time down to about 18 months instead of 15 years, as we've seen with tokamak and ITER. Any comment on whether those kinds of private skunk works are part of your knowledge network and what promise they may hold?
The Lockheed Martin in particular, it's way too early to make any judgment on their results. So at the present time, they have almost no experimental results. And they have some ideas which put pieces together, ideas that were discussed many years ago. So there's nothing there from which we can draw a positive conclusion that they're on some track to have a fusion reactor in 10 years. At the same time, it's fantastic that Lockheed Martin is interested in it. You know, I support that group working, that's great. You asked more generally about skunk works groups or private startups and companies that are working in this area. I think there's a real appetite out there in the private sector for quick ways to fusion and to just getting toward fusion. So there's a whole spectrum of them, and they vary from really a top-notch scientific group. There's a company in Southern California that's raised over $200 million for a more compact, maybe quicker approach to fusion. And it's a great group. We have some collaboration with them. I think the fact that the probability of them getting to a reactor in 10 years is small, but it's a great effort. You know, and then it goes all the way down, you know, to crackpots and in between. So I think all these are great, but there's no one magic bullet yet.
Please.
I think that boy is standing before me, so he should be asked the question.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Hi. I was just wondering, as a young person, what kind of things I can expect for the rest of the century in terms of climate change, and what's the biggest way that we young people can help?
Cool. Yeah, take the phone from Mike.
Great question. Look, if we go all in on clean energy and we commit to it now, you can expect the greatest economic opportunity of the last 100 years. And that's not according to me, that's according to McKinsey. So the real truth is, if you do the right thing here, you can imagine a job working in creating solar panels or building windmills or producing electric buses or producing Teslas. So there's a huge amount of really positive things that you can imagine in terms of a life that's much better than the quality of life we experience today. However, if we don't pick that path, if we keep investing in dirty fossil fuels and we hope somehow that's going to work, the next century is going to be very, very bleak. Like, I'm not going to go through all the latest science. I assume everybody's seen it, but it is not a pretty picture at all. So that's why I think, to answer your second question, what you can do to get involved, go to sierraclub.org, sign up.
That's why I was trying to get
Sign up, become an activist if you're here in Philadelphia. Talk to this guy over here. Gary Little's raising his hand. He runs our Beyond Coal campaign, and he's helping make sure that we can shut down the coal plants in this state and replace them with clean energy. He's working hard to get a tighter smog rule for Governor Wolf to endorse. So go help him and go to the website and tell Barack Obama to put in place a really strong smog rule for the country. And while he's at it, reject that Keystone Pipeline.
I might second.
No, you go ahead.
Maybe if you want to contribute in an occupational way, maybe get into something deeply. Become a deep policy expert, become a solar cell expert, become a fusion expert, develop some expertise and then contribute that way.
So I would say, and again, I agree with Jesse a lot, and that is educate yourself. I would encourage you to go to other resources other than Sierra Club's website, because there is because there is a lot of information from many different resources, from many different backgrounds and viewpoints, and I think we're all a much richer group of society when we see all viewpoints. So that's what I would encourage. I would encourage, we have some other young people here in the audience. I think more emphasis on STEM curriculum, science, STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. You can't go wrong. I think many of the societal issues that we're going to be faced can be solved with technology and some of those type of curriculum. So I would definitely do that. But I wouldn't just say that you need engineers, physicists, absolutely, they play an important role, and I'm just a little bit smarter sitting here next to the panelists. But I would say we also need, the next generation of regulators. We need the next generation of policymakers. We need people to fully understand what's happening around them, have a goal of, whatever it is, and then work hard and be willing to sit down at the table with people that come from different viewpoints, that may have a different attitude or characterization of the future, and work with them to kind of find solutions.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you to hold your question for the break, which we're about to have. I want to thank our panelists. If you want to become a future policymaker, by the way, that's wacphila.org. And I'm sure there's lots of good information in lots of places. Thank you all for a great presentation. Thank you. We'll be back in 15 minutes.